All right, folks. We will get started. And we have a very strict policy. How many of you went right after school? I went. Policy in regards to cell phones, talking, Chromebooks, they should be away, all right? We will eventually be doing secure tests in here. We want this to be similar to a actual AP test, and some of you will be in this room. And if your phone is out, if you have ear pods in, you are going to be asked to leave, and you're going to delay everyone's scores till October or November, which happened to us a few years ago. So we have to get into that mode. If your phone dings, vibrates on the day of the test, you will be asked to leave, okay? So we want to start to emulate that test environment. Also, being that it's not just Mr. Dowdy's AP review, albeit most of you were in my class. It includes first semester kids, so this room will eventually be full. All right, especially when we get towards the practice test. I don't suspect that you're going to be able to make everything. There are a ton of resources on this website, including the review schedule. And so probably too many resources at your disposal. I sent Albert IO invites out 2 weeks ago. I resent them out. So if you're trying to get on there, there should be an email somewhere in your email. So the schedule has to be flexible. Something might come up, who knows, where we may have to cancel a session. Check your emails. That's how you would be notified. So the link to the website is there. There are AP live reviews from last year. The content's the same.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 AP US Government and Politics live reviews. My name's Ashley.
And Jen. I will record. I started doing this under protest. I said I would never use Zoom again, but we'll record these review sessions for kids that cannot make them. Then I'll never have to do a review session again, too. And so that's one resource. They go through, I think they go through the units. I can't remember from last year. Get out of here. We will be going over all the units. We'll be spending time when we do the FRQs. These links are also short YouTube videos on how to attack them. Obviously, if you're in first semester, we looked at all 4 styles of questions. If you're in the current semester, we looked at concept, application, quantitative analysis. We'll do these 2 in Unit 5. Then when we get to these are actual AP multiple choice tests. And it's a good opportunity for individuals to get that practice so that when you show up on test day, you will not be overwhelmed. Just like an athlete, the more practice you get, the better you probably do. And so they're different, 3 different tests. They're secure, meaning you can't find them online. And so we take the test and then we go over the answers. It takes about an hour and a half. You will have 55 questions in 80 minutes on the actual AP test. We're only going to give you 60 minutes just because of time constraints for those 3 tests. So what you're going to find on test day, you're going to be fine with time. The FRQs on test day, you're going to have 4 of them. Each of them were 12.5% of your overall grade, half of your grade. Ultimately, for most students, the written portion of the test is going to be the indicator of whether you're going to get a 3, 4, or 5, hopefully 3 or higher. And so we'll do practice for each of these. And this is the big one. You'll have 100 minutes for that. And again, when we get to these FRQs, I'm gonna emphasize this, but I'll do it now. If you're not gonna be here on some of those days. Do not put all your eggs in the argumentative essay basket. Because they all count the same. In question number 1's were 3 points. Question number 4, the argumentative essays were 6. You miss 1 point out of 6, you're in a B range. You miss 1 point out of 3 for question number 1, you're in the D range. So the points don't really matter. They all end up being 12.5%. I think I emphasize really focus on these 3. You're gonna have plenty of time, 40 minutes left for the argumentative essay. But the first 3 are the most important. And a lot of kids do it the opposite. They think, oh, this is an argumentative essay. Well, it's still only worth 12.5% of your grade. No one likes an argumentative essay. So all the units we're gonna go over, and then on the day of the test, I'll go over the Supreme Court 15 required cases in the auditorium. You'll go take your test. What will it look like? You'll take multiple choice, you get like a 10-minute break, and then you'll take the 4 FRQs. If you're this room during the test, you might just happen to see Mr. Dowdy walk by. I can't communicate with you. Just to see if anyone's stressed. You will have someone in the room that is old, probably. And they're not a teacher in the district currently. And so it's going to be someone I don't know. And they will answer 0 questions you have. And I know I appear to be, I don't know, mean, whatever, because during the semester, if you come up and ask if the definition of words, I said, help, because you're not going to get any help on the test. You have to work your way through. And so, again, that's how the test day is going to look. This is pretty valuable. These cases are going to be on the multiple choice. They're going to be on the FRQ. Does anyone have any question on the structure of the test, how the test day is going to look, etc.? The main focus of today is Unit 4. I just want to briefly go back to this webpage. One up. Required documents. There's tons of different links. You're not going to be able to do all this. You can kind of look around, see what looks like it would be helpful for you for each of these tabs. But there's a lot at your disposal. I'll check the links this weekend to make sure they're all up to date, that they all still work. Unit 4, if you're going to err on really focusing on a unit, is weighted for the highest out of all 5 units. The other units are important, but this unit tends to be the lowest scoring, at least in the semester. And it's weighted the most on the actual AP test. The dealing with institutions of our government. Now, AP includes the judiciary in this unit. I take it out, me and Misty Tomasa take it out and put it with civil rights, civil liberties, just to make it a little less content. But the 3 branches of government are essentially Unit 4, Unit 2 for AP. I'm going to talk about this, and some of these we've looked at, some of them we will look at. It may not be in your packet. I'd have to go look. I can print this out. My students have access to this document on my webpage, not the review webpage, my webpage. It might be on the review webpage too. There are certain pieces of legislation that are in the curriculum. And so they're fair game. I can tell you which ones tend to appear more than others, but these tend to be, this one and this one are huge. All right. The Voters' Rights Act of 1965. Don't get enamored with years. Typically, if you said Voters' Rights Act of 1964, they're still going to accept that. It's not a date test. Civil Rights Act of 1964. These 2 are significant civil rights pieces of legislation. Those 2 have appeared on the test in the past. Clean Air and Water Act, we talk about that in the context of federalism, mandates from the federal government to the states. That's a good example of federalism. Federal Elections and Campaign Act, when you talk about the elections unit, is a piece of legislation that establishes transparency in elections. You have to tell the government where you're getting money, who it's coming from, how you're spending it, etc. The key to that is it starts a independent regulatory agency. We talked about this yesterday, Federal Elections Commission, to carry out the law. If you have an elections law, you need some kind of institution to carry it out. Title IX, if you're currently in my class, we'll go over it in the next unit. Also with the Civil Rights Act. Title IX bans gender discrimination in educational situations. It was a good example of allowing females the same access to athletics as males. Prior to that, for females, it was like club basketball in most schools. Now it's an official sport. War Powers Act, when you talk about the president, the executive expanding their power past what's in the Constitution as commander-in-chief, this was an attempt by Congress to get more transparency on, well, this time Vietnam. Freedom of Information Act, I don't know if that would appear on the text. It might. RFRA. It's a good one. No Child Left Behind, don't worry about. They got rid of that, so I don't think that would be on. McCain-Feingold is a big one. Bans soft money in elections. All right. Where you're trying to go around giving money directly to candidates. And we'll go over this in Unit 3. That review section, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Affordable Care Act, the one that's not on here, it should be on. I believe it's not on. The Welfare Reform Act, write it down. I don't know why it's not on this list. When you talk about devolution in Unit 1, giving power back to the states, Welfare Reform Act of 1994 is a big one. And that'll be in Unit 1. Yes, Tomaso probably talked about it today. Should have. So Congress, some of these notes I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It's not one of these tests where it's going to ask you how many members of Congress. So I ask you that and fool you. But we do need to know basic structure. Bicameralism should be very easy to remember. We do need to know that the House of Representatives is closer to the people. It was the only part of government originally elected directly by the people. The Senate wasn't. And the Senate has more of a country club atmosphere. The House has more of a library atmosphere, more rules. All right. And so the Senate becomes a branch of government that is directly elected with the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Do you need to know the amendments? Yeah. One of the foundational documents is the Constitution, and the amendments are part of that. That's really all I got for this set of notes that I think would be helpful. I can tell you, you can star which ones are most important. Again, the framers intended for this branch of government, Congress, to be very slow and deliberate. That's why you have a bicameral setup. If there's one chamber, it'd be a lot easier to pass legislation. With the idea that new Congresses aren't constantly changing federal law. They can, but the process of legislating is very slow and deliberate. And part of that is also obviously has to do with the executive branch and their veto power. Power is kind of decentralized in Congress. You do have the leaders of both chambers, But when I say decentralized, meaning most of the activity is in committee. And committees consist of not the entire Senate or House. So that's where all the action really occurs, and we'll talk about committees in more detail later. That's what I mean, decentralized. They don't spend a lot of time as a full chamber. The rules, well, we're gonna get into committees in a second. This set of notes may not even be in your packet, to be quite honest with you. I don't know if I have it on there. This is kind of a review of Unit 1. We have the same set of notes in Unit 1 in regards to the constitutional powers of Congress. All right. Expressed or enumerated is what you would call them. Now, are you going to ultimately, at the end of the day, need all of these? No, but there are certain powers you should probably put a question mark, a star next to. And you should probably be able to identify probably the biggest power of Congress, because I've said it 50,000 times this semester, which is power of the purse, the ability of Congress to fund. Not only does that give them power over the states, but it gives them power over the executive branch and theoretically the judiciary, although albeit not as much. Another big express power is the ability to tax and spend. All right, that is in the Constitution. These are enumerated, again, powers. Create inferior courts to the Supreme Court. We haven't looked at the judiciary, but there are 2 levels below the Supreme Court, which were established by Congress, not the Supreme Court. Declare war. This is one of those issues where you have a conflict between the executive branch and Congress or legislative branch. When you get into the argumentative essay, if you had a prompt which discussed conflict between branches of government, you could use the war powers as a certain conflict. Congress, declare war, president, commander-in-chief. So what does that really mean? Implied powers or powers established by the necessary, proper, or elastic clause are not explicit or enumerated in the Constitution. However, they are tied to something that is. All right. The ability for Congress to start a Department of Defense, establish a Department of Defense in the executive branch is not enumerated in the Constitution. But it certainly, most certainly would be tied to the ability to raise an army. You would have to have some entity to carry that out. I use the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service of the executive branch. Certainly not in the Constitution, but that would be attached to the power of taxation. So this is elastic, flexible, all right? Flexible. We go back to McCulloch v. Maryland. That was one of the key constitutional issues with that case. Could the federal government have a national bank? And the answer was yes, via the elastic clause. So again, not in the Constitution. You could see it as implied, elastic, or necessary and proper. Institutional means within the body. Some of the key ones. The Senate's unique ability to approve presidential appointments, whether it be to the bureaucracy or whether it be to the judiciary. That is a key power. If you had a prompt asking you about checks and balances, you could certainly talk about the Senate's unique role to be able to do that. It's not the House. They don't participate at all. Let's see. The Senate, the ratification, that would actually be both the Senate and the House. Powers denied. Some of these terms we go over in Unit 5, but that's fine. Ex post facto laws, meaning you can't punish someone who committed a crime before it was against the law. Ex post facto. So there are a lot of internet laws that were passed after the internet was developed and became more popular, and laws that were broken by people. But you couldn't go back and punish them if it wasn't a law. Bills of attainder, punishing for a crime without a trial. Suspending habeas corpus is the most likely out of the 3. terms to appear on the test. Habeas corpus is the ability to know what you're being charged with. And so where this is kind of violated by the government is, it says, Congress shall not suspend habeas corpus except in cases of rebellion or invasion. And so what has happened historically, most recently, I would say more so in the late 20th century, 21st century, is the executive branch, Department of Defense, has arrested individuals who are tied to terrorism, and they sit in prison without being charged. And so they can file and say, well, Congress can't suspend my writs of habeas corpus. You got to tell me what I'm being charged with. You can't go to trial until you're charged with something. And the executive branch has said, no, we can't tell you the evidence that we have because that would compromise our fight against terrorism. So there are people who are accused terrorists in prison for years, never go to trial. You go to the courts, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court is typically sided with the executive branch in regards to suspending habeas corpus, but for like average US citizen, they could not do that. And again, if you have any questions on any of these notes, please raise your hand. Congressional leadership, not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this set of notes. Other than saying, I gotta change them. Nancy's no longer in leadership since last November. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is probably the second most powerful person in American politics behind the president. It's not Vice President Harris. The Speaker of the House, because the House has such strict rules, really controls the agenda of the House of Representatives. And so that is a powerful position. They control committee assignments. They control who's on the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee determines a lot of very strict rules in the House. How long you can debate, whether you can add something to a bill or not. And so that is a very important committee. Kevin McCarthy, who is the Speaker of the House, had to make a lot of promises to people who didn't support him to get the speakership. The majority party picks, but there was division in regards to it. It was a long process. They voted like 13 times before he finally was selected. And so he promised a lot of members who were not on his team really, really good committee positions to get their vote. Perfectly legal to do. This is a party structure. It is not a constitutional structure on how you select these positions. In the Senate, the equivalent of the Speaker would be the majority leader. The Vice President presides over the Senate when there's going to be a vote that's going to be close. Because it is 50-50, she's going to be the tiebreaker. But typically, the Vice President is not spending any time in the Senate. They may be interacting with the leadership in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, to express the wishes of the president in the executive branch in regards to different types of public policies. This is probably one of the most important parts of this branch of government, this set of notes. What influences members of Congress and how they act, how they vote, what they support in regards to public policy, etc. There are three types. I hate these terms, to be perfectly honest with you, but AP loves them. It's going to be on the test, one of those three, if not more than one. If you see anything, and this is how you'll most likely see it in a multiple choice. They'll give you a scenario. All right. Senator so-and-so votes based upon a poll in his district. Okay. That would be the delegate role. All right. You're looking at who you represent, your constituents, and seeing how they would support a piece of legislation or not. Trustee role would be you're going by your own personal convictions. All right. You're saying I was elected. They must agree with my vision And trust me, that's the trustee role. Politico is a combination of both. All right, basically. And this term wasn't even in the curriculum until 4 years ago when they redid the curriculum. I'm like, what's Politico? I don't know what that is. I had to look it up. But it's taking a combination of both. If it's a piece of legislation that is high profile, then you're probably going to go by your constituents. Like if it's abortion bill, for example. That is going to be something that your constituents are going to feel strongly one way or another about. If it's a mundane bill that your constituents maybe don't care about, then you take this role. That's the combination of the two, Politico. And it's not that members of Congress get into office and say, I'm going to be Politico, I'm going to be trustee, I'm going to be delegate. It's you look at their behavior and how they act. This is what political scientists do. I could never be a political scientist, like who cares? Staff members play a big role in Congress. We'll talk in Unit 3 about the role of lobbyists, interest groups in trying to put forth legislation. Again, they provide, along with bureaucratic agencies, the written legislation in most cases. And so you're not going to have usually a direct line to the member of Congress. You're going to work with their staff. That's where lobbyists will go. Members of Congress aren't usually in their office unless you're George Santos trying to hide. Members of Congress aren't usually in their office a lot. During a campaign, they're back in their districts working, meeting people. They still have staff members in Washington, D.C. who are going to interact not only with constituents, but with lobbyists and interest groups. So they play a big role. Usually have 4 or 5 staff members. You get a budget if you're in Congress. You can use it however you want. A congressional caucus is a group of people. From electoral standpoint, we talked about caucus as a way to select a nominee in a group, big group. This is still conceptually a group. It's just a different function of the group. It's not an electoral group. It is a group of members of Congress with similar interests. It may not be based on party. A lot of times it isn't based on party. So there's lots of different caucuses. It's a grouping of people. Those 3 caucuses exist. There's a caucus for sportsmen, people who represent states or congressional districts where people want guns. I can tell you, John Tester, who's a Democratic senator in Montana, will have the same views as Ted Cruz, who is a senator from Texas, who is a Republican. So it's not always party. And gosh, I don't even know how many caucuses there are. The president, if the president is of the same party as the party in power in Congress, there's going to be a lot of influence. So Trump's first 2 years, he had a Republican Congress. He was a Republican. Then he lost it his last 2 years. Same thing with Joe Biden, at least with the House. He had the House and the Senate as Democrats, and then he lost the House. So if the president is of the same party as the leadership, they're going to have influence. Because obviously the president is going to sign a bill into law or veto. And if you're a really good, I don't know if Joe Biden fits under this or even Donald Trump, but I'll tell you who does, Barack Obama. I mean, he was kind of a rock star with the Democrats. So if you were a Democrat, you wanted him campaigning for you. So there are ways to punish or reward. And campaigning might be one of them, might be fundraising for a candidate. Campaign contributions, obviously you can't say as a political action committee, I'm going to give you $2,700 if you write and support this legislation. It's implied, right? We know, we don't have to even say it. It's implied that you're at least going to have access. It doesn't mean they're going to support everything you want, but you're going to have access. And you can guarantee, unfortunately, we had a school shooting, what was it, last week? Week before, it's all blurred out. These lobbyists go into action. And there are individual members of Congress who say, it's not a gun issue, it's a mental health issue. And then you go look and they're getting tons of money from the NRA and vice versa. The media can play a role in their watchdog function. Iron triangles, again, this relationship between a congressional committee, federal agency, and interest group on a similar issue. It could be Department of Education, Committee on Education in Congress, National Education Association on a particular public policy issue. It could be the Environmental Protection Agency, that bureaucratic agency. It could be Committee on the Environment in Congress, and it could be the Sierra Club, all on the issue of pollution. So iron triangles will be on the test in some way or another. And again, it may talk about simply this interaction between, without saying it's an interest group, congressional committee, member of Congress, it could be. That's it for that. Incumbency advantage is a little bit of a review from last unit. We did talk about it last unit. I can't remember it was on a test, but again, like, what is the advantage if you are an incumbent or currently in office that a challenger does not have? And so there are a lot of them. We know that members of Congress are reelected at a very high rate. You have to be a really bad member or die to not be reelected. The House is a little bit higher than the Senate because it doesn't get as much coverage. You know, you have a third of the Senate, it gets more national coverage because it's an entire state, not a little district. I can't tell you who ran against Sean Casten, your member of Congress. I can't. I have no idea. I know who we beat in the primary. We'll talk about that when we get to gerrymandering. Some advantages. Franking privilege is the ability to send mail. It can't say elect Representative Doughty, but it can tell you what your representative is doing for your district. We got money back for this project, federal dollars. I'm helping old people with problems. I'm passing laws to make it safer in my district. It's really a way to basically say vote for me without saying vote for me. I'm doing a good job for you. So it may not seem like, okay, they get free mail. Well, if you're a challenger and you represent a district with approximately 700,000 people and you want to send a flyer out, that's pretty expensive to do. Whereas a member of Congress can do it for free. And so that is one. Paid staffers, again, will help constituents. You can call your member of Congress. You want a flag that flew over the Capitol? You can probably get one from a member of Congress. You have an issue that you want to talk about, etc. You're not going to be interacting with the member of Congress. You're going to be talking to their staff. Patronage, the ability to give those who really, really support you a job. Obviously, again, they hire their own staff. Name recognition, constituent casework, again, that's where people are calling you up for help. Money, especially PAC contributions. We know, going back to Unit 3, that PACs give money to winners. If the incumbents are winning at 90 and 80%, they're getting the contributions, not the challengers, and certainly not minor parties. Gerrymandering, we'll look at the PowerPoint because it's pretty good. And then we'll talk about the two cases in this unit. Damn it, I use my finger and it doesn't ever work. Again, reapportionment and redistricting is the redrawing of lines if you lose or gain a seat in the House of Representatives. This is not the Senate. They don't go through this process. This is the House. Does every state redistrict? No, they do not. Reapportionment means reallocating the seats, the 435 seats, based upon population shifts every 10 years with the census. All right. So reapportionment again is just reallocating or moving around the seats based upon population. Redistricting is when you redraw the lines if you gain or lose a seat. Gerrymandering is doing it based upon political party, which the courts have said is perfectly fine. But at the same time, they've offered some rules when you redistrict. Again, it's not the federal government doing this, it's state by state. Most states, it's the state legislatures that are doing the redistricting. All right. But again, I talk about federalism 5,000 times in this course. It's a federalism issue. Every state is different, but most states, it is their state legislature. And so if a Republican state legislature redistricts, they're probably going to draw the lines to advantage them. Same thing with Democrats. Now, this is from 2010. If we looked at it again from 2020, we lost another seat. Texas gained another 3 or 4 seats. And so as you can see by this graphic, not every state does it. The states that are not colored are not going to be redistricting. If you had a question on federalism, or if you saw this graphic and it asks you like what constitutional principle is illustrated here, gerrymandering isn't in the Constitution, so that's not it. Federalism would be the principle. Why? Because every state is different. Love it. This has probably changed in 2020, but it lets you know who controls the state houses. So Republicans have a significant advantage when gerrymandering because they control most of the state houses. I can tell you these two are now controlled by Democrats, so it has changed probably in time. Again, we've lost another seat in this process. So Baker v. Carr, again, these Supreme Court cases, you have to know the constitutional principle. You can't just throw a whole bunch of principles. And my students have the packet from Marco, I think it's Marco, with all the cases that give you all of the constitutional principles. When you get to question number 3, which is the lowest scoring written portion in the country, our students, probably because I teach con law, so that's kind of my thing, court cases, our students tend to do well better, way better than the national average. But when you get to these cases, you have to identify the constitutional principle. Question number 3 is going to be worth 3 or 4 points. And so if you don't get part A, you usually can't get part B. And part A, regardless of the case that ends up appearing, because we don't know, it's going to be one of the 50. I don't think it's going to be Citizens. I'm not even going to say that. It's going to be one of the 50. And so if it's Baker v. Carr, this dealt with congressional districts in Tennessee, where rural areas had higher representation than urban areas. They had been drawn to benefit rural voters and constituents. And so the issue was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That is the only answer. If you said 14th Amendment, nope, don't get it. Don't get it. Because there's 3 provisions in the 14th Amendment. If you're in my class currently, you don't need to worry about those provisions. We're going to go over them in Unit 5. But the provision that was used as the constitutional principle in this case was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So if you had this case, that's the only thing you could put down for A. If you don't put that down, then you're not going to get more than half the points, if that. And so, I mean, obviously, I gave you like a cheat sheet, which was like a 1-pager with the cases at the beginning of the semester. Then you're going to need to talk about like a little bit of background in Baker v. Carr. You don't necessarily need to know every detail of the case, but you need to be able to identify the issue. As congressional districts, the populations were approximately the same. They're not going to be perfect, but approximately the same. And so that's Baker v. Carr. I don't know if, yeah, I think I do have it. One man, one vote. I use the example of baker's dozen, right? What's a baker's dozen? One extra. One man, one vote, Baker v. Carr. One man's vote is going to be approximately the same, or representation is approximately the same as another. I had one time, I don't know how long ago it's been. Mr. Dowdy, that is not politically correct. One man, one vote. And I'm like, you gotta understand, this is a quote from a Supreme Court case. I can't change the quote. If you see a quotation from this case, it's going to be one man, one vote. So I get it, but this case wasn't decided in 2022. Racial components to gerrymandering is where we get in Shaw v. Reno. Shaw v. Reno. When you're drawing districts based upon race only, that is a violation of the Constitution. So in this particular case, we had a state where lines were being drawn to give representation explicitly to African American voters. And it was very explicit in regards to that was the purpose. And again, the challenge, the good thing about these two congressional cases is they're both the same constitutional provision. 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. That's it. You put 14th Amendment, no go. You've got to be specific. Just like when we get into the First Amendment one's next unit, obviously first semester, we've already done that. Like there are 5 provisions to the First Amendment. You can't just put the First Amendment down. And we'll see examples of that soon enough in second semester. The lines must be contiguous or connected, all right? You cannot have a little island off of the main district. Relatively compact, meaning it can't meander. Now, who's going to determine the compactness? It's going to be the courts. So I would make the argument, well, this district here is clearly drawn. I mean, it's meandering and getting little areas. And you're like, well, that looks like a little island. There's probably just like a highway that connects that area. It's drawn to benefit incumbents. You are drawing the districts. You want it to benefit you. And so we get to part of this presentation, I believe. Well, I mean, clearly these are being gerrymandered for a reason. This one here, I can tell you gerrymandered for a Democratic district. Most people who live on the coast of California are mega rich. And you might say, well, why don't they vote for Republicans? We're talking like movie stars who tend to be a little bit more liberal. But clearly drawn for a reason to benefit individuals on the coast. This is a district around Chicago. I can tell you definitively, I used to live in this district when I lived in the city. Goes up northwest side of Chicago, very high Hispanic population, meanders through kind of the northwest suburbs, down 294, Elmhurst is right about there, goes down here to Cicero, Hispanic area of Chicago here by Midway. That's drawn to get a Hispanic representative. And indeed, it has a Hispanic representative. And you might say, well, you just said race can't be considered. Well, their argument is going to be, well, the Hispanic voters vote Democratic. It's not based on race, it's based on party. When we clearly know that's based on race, but a court ultimately will determine. The other Shaw versus Reno case, they were explicit on the rationale of drawing it. So race can be a consideration. It can't be the sole consideration when drawing a district. And so again, Barack Obama might never have become president if a member, and this wasn't at the federal level, he was never a congressman, he was a senator for 4 years before becoming president. But he was a state senator as well. And his opponent redrew these lines after the 2000 census because he was scared of Barack Obama. Obama lost to him first, but it was really close. And this guy had always blown out his competition. So they just drew out the neighborhood that Barack Obama's house was in. So he was no longer an opponent, could no longer be an opponent. But what they also did for Barack Obama is his new district that he lived in stretched all the way up to the Gold Coast, very affluent liberal area of Chicago, where he got into local politics. And you are living in the Gold Coast, you got money and you got access to people. So that's how he became president. Obviously by campaigning and whatnot, but that certainly helped him. So we're not going to look at your district. So AP is going to have something on gerrymandering. There's just no question about it. No question. Congressional committees. Again, this is where most members of Congress spend their time. And it's not always about talking about legislation, bills, okay? We'll talk about how a bill becomes law in a second. But before you vote on it in the full House or the full Senate, it's got to get out of committee. The key to committees are the chair, which is always determined by the party in power. Seniority plays a role too, but party comes first when you talk about how they select the chair. So every House committee is chaired by a Republican. Every Senate committee is chaired by a Democrat, because those two parties control each chamber. Why is that important? The chairs of each committee determine what you're doing. All right. So like Nancy Pelosi's like the principal, and the teachers are like each committee chair. We determine what happens in that classroom. So that's conceptually what this looks like. And so before it gets out of committee, the House, again, much stricter rules. There is what's called a discharge position. I don't think that's going to be on the test, but there's a formal way in which you can kind of force a bill out. But again, it's got to be the majority party. So that doesn't happen very often. This is probably the most important thing on this set of notes. What is the function? Handle legislation is one of them, obviously. Bill's got to get out of committee before it's voted on by members of Congress and the entire Senate or House. That's the easy one to do. When you're in committee, you might have people testify in favor of the bill. You might have experts, etc. So you'll have people come in and testify in regards of support of a bill, opposition, or opposition to a bill. So that's what most people think about members of Congress doing. These two happen all the time. All the time. Investigations. There is a January 6th committee that was started. It's not a standing committee or a permanent committee. It is a special committee. After 9/11, they had a committee that researched why. What did our government do wrong in regards to not being able to identify these terrorists? We have the strongest military counterintelligence in the world, and they were able to do that. So you could have investigations. Perhaps the most important thing and thing they do the most is this. And oversight is a term that is highly loved by AP. And congressional oversight is Congress in committee overseeing what these executive branch bureaucratic agencies and departments are doing. And if you're subpoenaed by congressional committee, you have to go testify. And so after 9/11, you can guarantee oversight happened. Okay, FBI director, higher ups in FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, you need to appear in front of the committee and tell us what went wrong and how you're going to fix it so this never happens again. Same thing with January 6th committee. Or it could be something like, okay, when Obamacare was passed, Congress spent tons of money on Obamacare, allowing for states to get money to set up ways in which people would buy healthcare from a state government. So block grant of money. And then when the federal government, Health and Human Services decided to start the web page that everyone could go to, it crashed. It crashed. And so the Secretary of Health and Human Services would call in front of committee, we just gave you billions of dollars. And you guys couldn't get a website that worked? So that's oversight. It's Congress overseeing these executive departments, these agencies in the cabinet. Not only that, independent regulatory agencies. IRS has been accused of targeting groups, conservative groups, for tax violations. When Republicans control the House, they said, okay, members of the IRS, you're coming in front of committee and you're going to testify, why are you targeting Republican groups, conservative groups? And they'll of course say they're not. The Democrats say they're not. But that's oversight. Again, in committee, you get called, you have to go. It could be a regular citizen. Again, selection of committee members, political party is number one. You're not going to have, even if they have the most seniority, someone of the minority party. The minority party will have what's called the ranking member, the highest member of the minority party. So again, the power of the chair is substantial. They determine what bills are going to be considered. You're a Democrat, you're kind of beholden to the Republicans in the House and committee. You can voice your opinion, etc., but your bills are probably not going to be the ones being considered. Unless you're doing a little log rolling, support it. You support my bill, I'll support yours. Some of the more important committees, Ways and Means is really important because taxation is really important. The ways and the means in which we run our government. Well, we need money. How do we get it? Taxation. So any tax bill is going to go to Ways and Means. Any revenue bill starts in the House. We talked about powers unique to the Senate. This is one that is unique to the House. Revenue bills, meaning taxation bills, must start in the House. They still have to be approved by the Senate, but they start in the House. Rules Committee, we already talked about. Appropriations means giving money. So of course you want to be on that committee. You're appropriating money for a variety of things. Could be projects. Oh, let's go back. I'll just talk about this real quick. Back to incumbency advantage. Pork barrel legislation. This is legislation that is in excess. It's bringing projects via cash back to your district. Think of a pig is fat, they have excess fat. This is excess spending. All right, so if your Congressman Caston is able to bring $50 million to bring or develop high-speed internet in your community, which you already have, but we'll just say that. Or $50 million to Elmhurst College to be able to build a new science STEM wing. That's pork barrel, benefits that district only. But again, you can say, look what I brought back to the district. That's pork barrel spending. That is another incumbency advantage. Because you could say, look what I'm doing for you. It's unbelievable. But that's coming from appropriations. Again, a committee that's unique to the Senate and not the House is the Senate Judiciary Committee because they approve judicial appointments. House doesn't approve judicial appointments. Senate Judiciary Committee also deals with immigration, which you may not think it would be in there, but immigration. But more importantly, when a Supreme Court justice is up, those senators are getting a ton of attention because it's got to get out of committee before it gets to the entire Senate. And so, yeah, this committee here is kind of a stepping stone for running for office. Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton was on that committee. Barack Obama was on that committee. Foreign Affairs is another big one. Highly prestigious. Again, another power unique to the Senate, they approve treaties. So when you talk about dealing with foreign countries, Foreign Affairs Committee is going to get a lot of attention. If there's a conflict or a war, going to get a lot of attention. A conference committee is temporary and not for every single bill. When you have bills that do not match the language that does not match, it goes to conference. You take some members of the House and the Senate of both parties, and you got to hash out the difference. The bills have to match. And you might have a bill dealing with immigration in the Senate that does not match because the individual senators or members of the House do not have the same views. I mean, some of these bills are thousands of pages long, especially when you get into a budget bill. And so they have to match. So it is a temporary committee. Not every bill needs to go to conference. Select would be like the January 6th committee. All right. I can't give you an example for joint. There's not usually really. There's joint committee on the library, which sounds like the worst committee you could possibly be assigned to. How a bill becomes a law. It's pretty straightforward. So again, the idea that the bureaucracy, which we'll go over, and interest groups play a big role in how the bills are worded. All right. Again, most bills don't get out of committee. They just sit there. They sit there. There are tons of bills that never ever get out of committee. Most bills, so you have authorization, then appropriation. Most bills have money attached. Like if a bill is establishing something, it's got to be money attached. There is a special part of Congress called the Congressional Budget Office, which includes financial, economic experts who put a price tag to a new program. Congress can't do that. You don't know. Committee action passed or reported out means it will go to the entire Senate or the House. But again, most are pigeonholed, which means postponed indefinitely. That is the most frequent fate. Not a lot actually get voted on and then die in committee, no get out. I mean, why are you going to vote on it if you know that it's not going to get out of committee? Rules Committee in the House is important. It will set the limits on debate. Okay, every member of the House gets 3 minutes to talk about the bill. You have 435 members of Congress. You have to have a stricter policy. The Senate has the filibuster. Again, not in the Constitution. That is a Senate rule. They could get rid of it if they wanted to as a majority party. But the filibuster is the ability to slow down legislation. In the Senate, a House, you need one person can put a hold on a bill or an appointment, a Senate hold. Doesn't happen often because if everyone's holding against everyone else, then nothing is going to get accomplished. But it does happen occasionally. Those two rules are in the Senate and not in the House. So again, the House is very strict. The Senate is not. So what can the president do? Obviously veto. Are there a lot of vetoes? No. Why would you spend months in committee on a bill and then getting it out of committee, getting it approved by the House and the Senate if you know the president is going to veto it? So that doesn't happen very often, especially when the presidency and the two branches of government or the legislative branch are of the same party. Could it happen? Obviously, yes. What happens if the bill just sits there? Then it's automatically after a certain amount of time becomes a law. If Congress is in session. They're out of session, that's where you get this idea of a pocket veto. So that doesn't happen very often. I don't think you're ever going to see that on the test. But veto most certainly is. If you're talking about a check between those two branches, that's a good one. Much like the overview of Congress, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this one. Unbelievable. Again, it's not gonna ask you on the test, how old does the president have to be? All right, but there are stipulations in the Constitution that are fair game. Of course, that would be fair game, but it's just, that's not the style of questions on the AP test. And again, we see another amendment here, 22nd Amendment. Obviously, originally, one of the compromises, Unit 1, was not a lifetime appointment, but 4-year appointment. FDR was elected, what, 4 times? And so then there was concern amongst members of Congress that this is looking like a monarch or a king, and therefore you have the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which limited it to 2 4-year terms. How do you remember that? 2 + 2 is 4. I don't know. 22nd Amendment. You don't need to know how much they're paid, but it's not as much as you maybe would think. President. Secession. So what happens if the president dies, like JFK, then the vice president is the president. So there's not a lot in this set of notes. This set of notes is a little more important. Constitutional roles of the president. We can say a chief legislature because of the role that they play in the legislative process. That veto power is extremely important. And so by being able to veto a piece of legislation, because it's not going to be overridden, 99.9% of the time, you're not going to get 2/3 of the House or the Senate to override a presidential veto. That is huge. That branch of government proposes legislation. Now, it's not usually the president going to Congress. It could be the vice president. It could be the chief of staff. The president has an executive office that has a lot of different people that work in it. They're advisors to him, and we'll go over the difference between those advisors and the cabinet secretaries, because there is a difference. Make a State of the Union address. This is in the Constitution. It is a enumerated power. And so the ability to go in front of the national public on TV and in front of Congress, some Supreme Court justices show up and put forth an agenda. This is what I want to do. And a lot of it's not going to be partisan, meaning really Democratic or Republican. It's going to be things that most people are going to be able to say, yeah, that sounds good. We're going to decrease illegal immigration. Biden will say that. Obviously, Trump will say a little bit stronger language. Be able to stop terrorism. Who's going to disagree with that? But how are you going to do it? Make healthcare more affordable. I think any American can say, oh yeah, that's good. But how are you going to do it? Because a Republican and a Democrat are say 2 different things. But the president gets to make a speech to Congress, and usually members of Congress sit there nicely. We have a few that are a little, they're tweaking. Chief executive, or the ability to carry out laws. Again, government, when you think about the federal government, it is the bureaucracy. It's not the White House. But obviously, we'll talk about the role of the president in selecting the leaders of those departments. Executive orders are a way to get around the or circumvent the formal legislative process. The president can pass an executive order on virtually anything. So you talk about Donald Trump directing the Department of Homeland Security. We are not accepting citizens from these 7 countries. There's no law that said that. Congress would never probably pass a law that said that. He just signed an executive order. It just happens. And you can challenge it in a court of law. The courts determine whether or not the president went too far. President Biden signed an executive order saying if you made under a certain amount of money, you got $10,000 or $20,000 of student loan debt erased. He directed the Department of Education to start a program. that allows for that. He doesn't carry out that. The Department of Education does, and there have been challenges to that. And it will be heard in front of the court. So they got a lot of power. Those departments do a lot of things. When Barack Obama was the president, he directed the Department of Education to have bathrooms that were open to either gender neutral. Donald Trump took over. He said, Department of Education, nope. We're not going to force states to do that, school districts to do that. Now, when I first came here, we did not have unisex bathrooms. When Barack Obama directed the Department of Education with an executive order, then we did. And then Trump said, Department of Education, we're not going to enforce this. It's no longer executive order. We still had bathrooms. So they were already established, but executive orders could be on a variety of different things. Chief diplomat, the ability to meet with heads of other states. Presidents do that a lot. Joe Biden did not do that a lot at the beginning of his presidency because of COVID. He's finally, in the last year and a half, met with heads of other states. They do it virtually, but come on, it's Zoom. There were a lot of LOL moments when Trump was president and they'd all the world leaders would meet. They'd be like walking to take a picture, and Trump would push like another member of from another country out of the way. I mean, it was wild because he always had to be at the front. Chief jurist. So he does have some power over the judiciary. One power he has is the ability to issue pardons, which is to forgive somebody for a crime. It has to be a federal offense. So like if Trump is thrown in jail because of these indictments that went through, he could not be pardoned by a Republican or a Democratic president. It's not federal law. This is state law that he was charged with. But perhaps the most important or biggest influence is the ability to appoint federal judges. Not only at the Supreme Court level, actually, probably the more important level is the Circuit Court of Appeals, which most cases end there. And the district court. Any judge that is appointed by the executive branch comes from the president, approved by Senate. So there is a check there. Non-constitutional roles, head of political party. Donald Trump is still the face of the Republican Party. Still, who knows what's going to happen? He'll probably get the nomination. I think this indictment actually will help him because he's getting a lot of coverage, and his supporters are very, very avid. And so it may end up helping. His polling numbers have gone up since all this started to go down. But we got a long way before next June, not this June, but next June when both parties will select. So there are some non-constitutional rules as well. The presidential support staff, I'm not going to spend a lot on here, but what you have to understand is some of these positions are approved by the Senate, some are not. The immediate advisors, this is what they do. They advise the president. Do not need Senate approval for the most part, almost all of them. When you hear this term West Wing, that's where they work. East Wing is the wing where the First Lady has some advisory, but that doesn't get a lot of coverage. Obviously, the West Wing, they made a series out of it. So these are some examples. Office of the Management and Budget prepares the annual budget. So they deal with the bureaucratic agencies, provide requests for all these agencies to Congress. All right. It's not every member, or excuse me, every bureaucratic agency has, obviously they work with Office of Management and Budget. But those are the individuals who deal with formulating a budget. The president requests a budget of Congress. That budget is for running the government. National Security Council, all right. It is now changed. Obviously, the president has individuals were security experts who give him advice. Every day, the president gets a list of issues, if you will, that are Secret Service, CIA, FBI, Department of Defense. He gets a report every single day. And you don't know anything that appears in that report because it doesn't get public. These are things that if you saw like what we've stopped from happening, you'd be like, whoa. But every single day. So that is a very important. We're talking about foreign policy, military policy, national security. CEA, Council of Economic Advisors. So these people are giving economic advice. The president, whether historically they should or should not be blamed or credited for how the economy goes, will ultimately be the one who does get the credit or criticism. So those advisors don't need Senate approval. Another one is the press secretary, gives daily, usually daily, reports to reporters. Got a lot of attention during COVID, probably because Trump would always show up, but usually it's just the press secretary providing this is what the administration is doing in general. Now they're probably getting questions about security, shootings, etc. And that's in front of the media. So the White House press corps, it's like every major news outlet has one person that follows the White House for 4 years. That's all they do is follow the president. It's quite fascinating. The cabinet does need Senate approval. All right, there are a few positions as advisors that are cabinet rank and therefore need approval. I misspoke on the OMB. CIA director, White House counsel, meaning his personal lawyer. Yeah, so they're cabinet rank and they meet with the president periodically whenever the president wants to meet with them. But these are the heads of all those bureaucratic agencies: Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, Secretary of the Interior, which is all for parks, etc., Secretary of Health and Human Services. So all of these subject specific secretaries are appointed by the president with Senate consent. And that's what's referred to as a cabinet. So they get these positions based upon, it could be loyalty, it could be support. Pete Buttigieg ran against Biden for the Democratic nomination. He didn't win, but he got a position. After he dropped out, he supported Joe Biden. Guess what? He's the Secretary of Transportation. Jennifer Granholm, who was a former governor of Michigan, was constantly on TV supporting Joe Biden on CNN, primarily MSNBC. I forget what department she is the secretary of. Or wait, is she transportation? I don't know. But she got a position. It's not because she's an expert on whatever department she's leading, because she supported Joe Biden. How can the president influence the cabinet? Well, they can remove the secretaries if they don't like what they're doing. But the problem is when a secretary leads a department, they got to please hundreds of thousands of workers. And so that's like the superintendent is the president. The principal is the secretary. And all the teachers are workers. Custodians are workers. Aides are workers. Dr. Bagdasarian has to worry about things being happy and everyone working together here. He still has to answer to the superintendent, but his main concern is his workers here. We had a principal years ago. She retired probably, well, now it's probably been 7 or 8 years. She was principal for like 12 years. Her and the superintendent, oh my God. It was like this, Dr. Moyer, like this. She was protecting her teachers. It's the same idea conceptually here. The cabinet secretaries have to work every day in their departments. And so while a secretary may have a little bit of pressure from the president. They are more influenced in regards to their workers, people in their department. But they are appointed by the president with Senate approval. Great example would be Jeff Sessions, who was Donald Trump's first attorney general. And Donald Trump wanted investigation of Hillary Clinton, the emails, etc. And he didn't do everything Donald Trump wanted. He said, I am the head of the Department of Justice. I have to go by the rule of the law, not what President Trump wants. And they kind of butted heads too. And eventually he was dismissed by Trump, which certainly can happen. Again, all these workers, well, we're going to talk about the bureaucracy later. That's it. Vice president really has no formal role in the Constitution, other than you become president, the president steps down or dies. The bureaucracy, again, is the part of the executive branch that is the most foreign to you, at least coming into the course. These agencies are the government. They're not in the Constitution. Like nowhere in the Constitution does it say we have all these agencies. But implied powers would be like, if there's taxation in the Constitution as enumerated power, it's implied that you're going to have the IRS. If there's an army in the Constitution as an enumerated power, it's implied that you're going to have the Department of Defense. These agencies can be eliminated just like that. How do you do it? Don't fund them. That's it. Don't fund them, they don't exist. Or you can start a new agency, but it's Congress that does it. After 9/11, they started an agency called the Department of Homeland Security. It didn't exist prior to 9/11. But Congress, after 9/11, and with the request of George W. Bush, they said we need a specific agency dealing with Homeland Security, terrorist threats. We do have the Department of Defense, which the CIA falls under, the FBI, but we need a separate department, border security, etc. So you can start one of these departments anytime you want, but that's the cabinet positions. There are other positions in the executive branch that aren't the cabinet and have unique, this is the big one, have unique powers to regulate. These are very, very specific, independent regulatory agencies. These will appear on the test. For sure. For sure. And so Congress, it depends on the commission. It's 5 to 14 years. So the president gets to select individuals to lead these agencies. They can get rid of them, but they have to have cause, meaning a reason that is reasonable. Janet Yellen was initially the head of the Fed under Obama, appointed by Obama when Donald Trump took over. He didn't like her. He didn't like her economic policy because the Fed gets to, well, we'll talk about the Fed's power because it's important. They get to make regulations over the economy, over banks. And Trump wants, as a Republican, a truly free market Republican, doesn't want a lot of regulations. And so they have the ability to essentially make laws. It's not called a law, it's called a regulation on subject specific stuff. So the Fed, again, people struggle with fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is taxing and spending. That is done by Congress and the president. Monetary policy is the supply of money banks must have on hand, making it easier or more difficult to borrow money. If the Fed says you have to have 50% of your deposits in the bank, that means you only have 50% that you can loan out. They can change that. Okay, 25%. Now you have 75% you can loan out. The economy is doing bad. We're going to allow banks to loan more money out. This is monetary policy. And then interest rates that you have to pay for loans, etc. So this is not an economic class, but monetary and fiscal policy will be on the next. Fiscal, taxing, and spending, that's Congress. Monetary, the Fed, Federal Reserve Board. That's a regulatory agency. The other probably likely one you might see, the Food and Drug Administration is a great one. If you had to do an FRQ on the Food and Drug Administration, it's all COVID, right? The Food and Drug Administration determine whether or not the vaccinations were available to the public. That's a huge power, but it got a lot of attention with COVID. And so if you had to give an example of how they can regulate, that would be a great example. The IRS taxation is another good one. Federal Elections Commission. All right, determining what kind of ads you can run. It can be challenged in a court of law. Determining whether you've broken federal election law. Again, the bureaucracy is giving discretionary powers by Congress. And Congress can impeach the heads of these regulatory agencies if they want it. So it's not only impeaching judges, not only impeaching the president, but they could also impeach some, not all, these leaders of these departments. But discretionary power, they have the discretion to pass regulations. That's pretty big. Controlling the bureaucracy. Again, the Senate plays a significant role in this, but power of the purse is a big one. All right. You don't fund them. You don't fund them, they don't exist. If you threaten not funding them, they're probably gonna maybe be a little more willing to listen to what you want. So again, the president has some power by appointing the heads of these departments, proposing a budget. But the Senate, the legislative branch, has a little bit of a role in this process as well. The vast number of government workers have their jobs based upon merit. All right. And merit means qualifications, education, etc. And so it's not based on patronage, who you know, it's based upon merit. And this is due to civil service examination, where you prove, I don't know what it looks like. But presidents just can't remove workers when they take over. They can remove all the leaders of those departments, but they can't remove, like Dr. Fauci. Trump hated Dr. Fauci. He couldn't remove him. He worked for the CDC for 30 plus years. He had a sterling record. Trump hated him, couldn't remove him. He could remove the leader of the Department of Health and Human Services, but he couldn't remove the person who was making the call in regards to mitigation for COVID, et cetera. It's a great example. Again, appropriation, oversight. Interest groups play a role again with this idea of an iron triangle. All right. A lot of the people who leave, who are no longer cabinet secretaries, guess who they go work with? An interest group. Interest groups like, we'll pay you $2-3 million a year if you'd be a lobbyist for us. Why? Because they knew everyone in all of those departments. Congressional staff members, okay, member of Congress doesn't win, retires, they go work for a lobbyist or as a lobbyist. Why? Get paid $1 million. Oh, okay. I made $100,000 as a staff member. I need to make $1 million as a lobbyist. Why would an interest group pay a staff member $1 million? Because they know people in Congress. They have access. And so we call that the revolving door. You leave Congress, you go become a lobbyist. You leave the bureaucracy, Shep, are you focused? Seem to be having a little conversation with your little setter friend there. Unbelievable. It is unbelievable. Let's see. A few things, and then we're out in 4 minutes. These notes are in your packet. This is a theory. It's called the imperial presidency. The idea that presidents have started over the history, mostly in the 20th century, getting far more powers than are enumerated in the Constitution. You can look at them. The war power is an example. Executive agreements, an example. Executive privilege, the ability not to disclose information. in regards to their dealings in the executive branch. So presidents have most certainly got more power than that's in the Constitution. So how does Congress address that historically? Obviously, power of the purse, again, I continue to go back to that. One thing is passing laws, War Powers Act, okay. We have an issue with you just sending troops without a formal declaration. We're gonna pass a law that restricts what you could do. Well, guess what? Who enforces a law? The executive branch. Are they gonna enforce a law that restricts their power? Not really. So where the intention of the War Powers Act was to kind of rein in the executive, wasn't very successful, but it's there. Obviously, the confirmation of presidential appointees, leaders, is a way to kind of rein in those departments as well. You can forget about this. Don't even look at it. Don't ask me about it. Legislative veto is no longer in the curriculum. Last set of notes, you do not want to leave before I get through this. Government subsidy is giving them money. All right. AP likes the term subsidy, so you're gonna see that in the context of giving money to the states, giving money to people. Again, COVID has lots of government stuff. You ever get into federalism question? Talk about COVID, the interaction between, or maybe conflict between states and the federal government. But a subsidy during COVID was a check to American citizens for $1,500 if you made under a certain amount of money. That's a subsidy. All right, a subsidy maybe giving every pharmaceutical company who processes or produces a vaccine for COVID money, federal dollars. I mean, that goes against free market, the federal government giving a corporation money, but that happens all the time. And guess what? These corporations have lobbyists who advocate for that. If we're giving money to people, sometimes that money is determined based upon a means test. All right, a means test means you have to show that you don't have the means to spend money on food. So it is a income-based formula, and I don't know exactly what it is for food stamps. You have to make under a certain amount of money. That is a means test. There is a means test to be able to get that subsidy. Welfare is a means test. Federalism means that it's at the state level, but every state is different to determine what you need to get that benefit, that subsidy. Social Security has no means test. Means you get it whether you're rich, poor, etc. If you paid into the system, there is no means test for that. Same thing with Medicare, which is medical care for old people. All right, Medicare. There's no means test. AP likes this idea of a means test. I don't know if it'll appear on May 1st, but they do like it. So that's all I've got. If anyone has any questions on the way out, feel free to ask them.